please help me welcome Professor Kiesling.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and thanks to Mike for inviting me. This is great. Not just power in the electricity sense, but power in the political sense and the market power sense, right? So there's three different senses in which I'm interested in power. And I'm really thrilled to be here to talk with you today about the intersection of those three pieces of power. And in particular, I think one reason, can I be louder? How are we doing at the back of the bus? Are we good? All right, cool. Because I'm generally naturally loud and don't need to be amplified. But one of the things that I think I would like to highlight today is that there's a lot of really neat and interesting stuff going on in the electricity industry having to do with how regulation affects innovation and technological change, and how innovation and technological change may happen even when regulators and regulated firms try to shape the future of innovation or try to put roadblocks to innovation. Innovation happens whether they want it to or not. And I think the reason that Professor Munger invited me to speak with you today is that there are a lot of really good themes in what's going on and how I choose to analyze what's going on now in this industry that are at their core a very PPE way of studying and analyzing what's going on. I'm going to focus mostly on the political economy aspects of it, but there's also some more philosophical stuff that maybe we can come up with in the questions. I would classify them as more kind of epistemology, knowledge-oriented type things within philosophy. So I'm happy to raise those in discussion. I'm not going to highlight them in my own remarks, though. So let me dig in and give you a framework for the themes that I am thinking of when I say, okay, if I'm kind of looking through the lens of political economy and thinking about stuff that probably you didn't think about much at all coming into today, or that you don't think about every day, right? You know, you come in and the electricity is on, you flip the switch, the light goes on, you plug in your phone and it charges. You know, and especially around here in the summer, you turn on the air conditioner and it works, right? You don't think about those things very consciously, I would presume, right? But if you did, you're like, wow, this is awesome. How does this happen, right? So I want to bring some of the kind of wonder of that to life in some of what I want to talk about today. But the themes that I think resonate with thinking about political economy that I want to highlight are, number one, starting with the ideas of kind of property rights and markets and how well-defined property rights are and how much of our exchange and our interaction in markets relies on contract, transactions that are mutually beneficial, and the important role that property rights plays in that. Right? And this is a topic with which I suspect you're pretty familiar. But a lot of people don't really think about the extent to which the institutions, the property rights institutions, the regulatory institutions in which we do exchange actually affects our incentives to innovate. And that's something that I really want to pull out. And so at its core, you know, part of the argument is that institutions create the incentives that that give people incentives to do things like innovate. Because if you're innovating, you're thinking for the long term, right? You're thinking not just, how do I satisfy immediate basic needs today? And you're thinking more, what can I create that's new, that's different, and how does that create benefit for me in the future by creating benefits for others in the future as well. I'm also going to rely on some issues or some themes that you've probably already seen, given my look at the syllabus, having to do with some of the distinctions between decentralized decision-making in markets versus institutions that impose top-down decision-making through regulation, And I will pull in some kind of public choice theory. So then we kind of analyze that intersection of political and economic power. All right. So those are just some themes I wanted to put on the table to set the stage, and invoking our kind of common idea of the idea of property rights as a bundle of sticks, and that one of the things that we do when we engage in exchange is we might trade away some or exchange rights to do certain things with property. And that'll definitely come up in my discussion of what's interesting that's going on in the electricity industry. So let me give you a little context, because I'm going to assume that, unlike me, you don't think about this industry 24/7, 365. Yes, I am that nerdy girl. I think about this industry a lot. It's a really fascinating industry if you like technology. And historically, so physically, the way the electric power system works traditionally, the way it's worked for 130 years has been, you have a whole bunch of generators, large, like big, coal-fired or gas-fired or hydroelectric generators, power plants, and they generate electricity, send it on wires, high voltage transmission wires that are then, through transformers, dropped down to the lower voltage distribution wires network. And it's that wires network that then sends electricity into buildings like this, like your dorm, like your houses, shops, hospitals, factories, etc. So one of the things you should notice in the little story I just told is the very one-way direction here. This is a very sort of unidirectional thing. The flow of electricity, the flow of electrons, and the flow of economic value is from generators to consumers. Very one way. And there are generators and there are consumers. And those are two different types of participants in this market. Two different types of participants in this network, right? So simultaneously, I want to encourage you to think both about the economic interactions here, the economic interconnectedness and the physical interconnectedness. Right? In order for this to, the value to happen, in order for you to be able to flip the switch and the lights go on, all of the parties here have to be interconnected physically on a physical network, a wires network, as well as engaging in economic transactions. Let me give you a little bit of history to start off with. I wear a couple of different hats. One of the hats I wear is economic historian, a historian of technology. And it's one of my favorite things about this industry is its history. It's really rich. So if you're a fan of history, I can give you some good reading tips. I want to invite you to think back to the early 1880s. And the early 1880s, and in particular, there's one innovator who transformed American technology in a lot of different ways, and this industry was top of the list, and that's Thomas Edison. So in 1882, Thomas Edison was looking for new business opportunities after having spent, I think, what's the number, and you may have heard this batted about recently, there have been some interesting articles about him, 10,000 times. He tried 10,000 different ways to come up with a commercially viable, mass market friendly light bulb. And he tried one and it failed, and tried it again and it failed, over and over and over again. On the 10,000th go, he finally got a light bulb that had a good filament and the right gas in it and a nice globe, and it wouldn't explode, and it lasted for long enough that it was actually potentially commercially viable. And this light bulb, which we associate with Thomas Edison, he's sort of an iconic figure in American technological history, that was just one part of the story for Edison, though. For Edison, he had invented and designed an entire system of the generation, distribution, and sale of electricity. And what was that for? Lighting. In 1882, the leading edge technology for lighting in the home was either kerosene lanterns, kerosene lamps, or gas lighting. And there were some places that had what was called coal gas, and they would put pipes in houses, and you get gas come in, and that would light the candles in your chandelier. And there were lots of downsides to these lighting options. And so electric lighting, Edison thought, was going to be kind of his big key. This is going to be his big breakthrough. And he invented the whole system, all the way from the steam turbine to generate the electricity, the direct current network to distribute it, and the lighting fixtures on the wall inside the home. And that was the service that he sold on the market in 1882 from his Pearl Street substation near Wall Street in Manhattan. And he owned, and the whole idea was that this system was vertically integrated. Vertically integrated means that it's one firm that is doing all of the different functions in the supply chain, doing all of the different, potential different transactions with the customer. So Edison Electric owned the generator, the wires, the lighting fixtures in the home. And that was the bundled, vertically integrated service that they sold. In 1882, the electric light was this, culturally. Right? Electric lighting was the iPhone of the 1880s. This was the bleeding edge, cool thing that all the early adopters had. Right? And so not surprisingly, Edison's first customers were people with the names of Morgan. J.P. Morgan was actually a big investor in Edison Electric. Whitney, Whitney, I'm sorry, I'm just going through museum names now in my head. Morgan, Whitney, Frick, I'm still going through museum names in my head. Vanderbilt. This was the kind of bleeding edge technology, and Mrs. Morgan made a big splash when, actually it wasn't Mrs. Morgan, it was Mrs. Vanderbilt, made a big splash when she was able to host a ball in their mansion in Manhattan and have the whole place ablaze without it being in danger of coming down in some horrible fire because there's so many kerosene lanterns or candles. So this was a big deal. And the origins of this industry are in invention and in new ideas. And Edison himself said very, very bluntly that he saw himself as being in competition with other inventors, and that it's the competition with other inventors, and reinforced by the fact that they were, he would go and get patents, and a patent confers a monopoly for a period of time to the inventor, a monopoly over the rights to use or license whatever it is they invent, right? So there's property rights issue number one. And this started small, right? It's like a 2-block, 3-block radius that Edison is doing this in. Edison has this mad genius collaborator named Nikola Tesla. You may have heard of him. There's a car company named after him. Tesla invented most of, and has the patents to, most of the technologies that we still use to this day for electric motors, transformers, all sort of stuff that's in the guts of this system. Well, one thing that Tesla saw that Edison didn't was that there were ways that you could engineer this system where you could put generators, like huge generators, way outside of town, instead of having them kind of right next door. And these are basically coal-fired generators in the basement of your building, kind of chugga, 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 chugga. So there's vibration, there's smoke, there's coal, there's soot. Tesla basically comes up with these technologies that says, basically, we can do all that generation way out there, hundreds of miles away, do these high voltage wires, and have the same kind of system in our homes. And so Tesla ultimately left Edison and went to work with George Westinghouse from Pittsburgh. This picture here has Tesla's nameplate on it. And this whole story that I've told you, in addition to just being a nice history story, leads up to something really important that you can see from this picture. This is Tesla's design for turbines underneath Niagara Falls. And this turbine room underneath Niagara Falls, I think there's like a dozen of these turbines. And they use all of that force coming over the falls to generate electricity. Now, the one thing that I hope you notice, and should be the first thing that you noticed when you saw this picture, is there's a guy standing here. Now, assume that this guy is average height for 1892, which is, I think, when these were installed. So if he's average height for 1892, he's like 5'9". So what does that mean is true about this turbine? That sucker is probably 12 feet high. And there's 12 of them, I think 12, underneath Niagara Falls. Scale. Invention in the late 19th century in this industry becomes a story about scale. How large can these things be? How much electricity can we generate? And the answer here is actually gigawatts. Right? It's not watts, it's not kilowatts, it's not megawatts, it's gigawatts. That changes, that changes the entire economics of this industry. But it doesn't necessarily change how things are happening on the ground in the cities. So in cities like New York and Chicago, where electric lighting is the big deal thing. And so the city councils would give franchises to multiple companies to come in and operate. And so they would have these huge scale generators outside of town, and then large scale wires networks to bring the electricity into where the people were. And in Chicago, by 1900, there were about a dozen different firms that were competing with each other to sell electric power service. And this ends up being what I guess I would call kind of competition as a bit of a binge purge process, where there are a couple of companies competing with each other to sell electric power service in Chicago. They're earning profits. Another firm says, oh, hey, I can do that. They enter. But with these large economies of scale, what happens is that when other firms enter, the incumbents can then really lower their prices, and whichever firms are the high-cost firms, they can't hang. And they get driven out of the industry, and one of the incumbents, invariably this would be Commonwealth Edison, which if any of you are from Chicago, you know ComEd, still to this day, would buy up the assets of the exiting firm. And so you get this rivalrous competition driving prices, retail prices to consumers down low, but then they would go so low that at least one firm couldn't earn a profit and couldn't stay in the industry, so they get bought out. And so you get this process of consolidation. Ultimately, this consolidates into one or two firms in each city. And this is the progressive era. There's one big concern that people have once you get these large-scale firms, and there's only one of them operating. They're going to be able to charge monopoly prices, charge high prices to consumers, and that's going to be bad for consumers. So you get this very populist-motivated impetus for some kind of external regulation of this industry. But there's also a really good industry reason for wanting regulation as well, because there's this entry, exit, entry, exit, entry, exit. And they've had to, ComEd, Sam Insel took out a ton of debt to buy up all of these exiting firms in this fire sale. And all of that entry, exit, it was very disruptive. And so they saw control as, in essence, protection. They'd be protected from competition. And so the industry eventually welcomes what's called rate of return regulation as a political bargain. And so it's sort of a very high level, sort of the girl next door story about how this industry started. It started in invention, it started in competition, and then the inventions themselves were of such a massive scale that they led to very large scale firms that became what we can, and we have a theory of in economics called natural monopoly. And that caused a lot of concerns. They became regulated as natural monopolies, and the first state-level regulatory agencies were formed in New York and Wisconsin in 1907. And so starting in 1907, this industry is facing economic regulation. So economic regulation in this industry means there's entry barriers, right? So government provided entry barriers. So if you are an electric company within this particular geographic footprint, you're the only electric company and you have the legal monopoly over the right to generate, distribute, and sell electric power. And nobody else can come in and compete against you. In return for that, you've got to serve everyone who comes into your territory. It's called an obligation to serve. This give and take is called the regulatory compact. And that regulatory compact actually served the country really well through the 1950s, 1960s, when the kind of technology plateaued. The social policy objective was universal electrification and having these regulated monopolies, these utilities, provide safe, reliable, and affordable energy. Safe, reliable, affordable. So the focus here is least cost, and the technology here is very much mechanical technology, right? And it's these large-scale generators, large-scale wires. And that, was pretty much what we had through the 60s, 70s, and it's what we've had, we still have very much to this day, certainly in places like North Carolina, Duke Energy, this vertically integrated system as a regulatory matter as well as a business matter and a technological matter is very vertically integrated, right? One firm providing all of these, the whole supply chain and all the transactions in it. There has been some deregulation. I'm going to use scare quotes around that because it really isn't. It's just been some restructuring of how regulation works at the state level. And there's been more liberalization of wholesale power markets at the national level because of technological change. Right? So one criticism that you could offer of my argument is that it sounds like I'm a bit of a technological determinist, right? That I think technological change drives a lot of these other changes, right? So there's something, there's a thesis there that is ripe for being critiqued, right? Is that really true? It's not entirely what I'm saying, but I wouldn't. But it is a bit what I'm saying. I think there's a good argument there that technological change drives a lot of these things. And in the 1990s, the drive that happened that liberalized wholesale power markets at the national level was a particular technology called the combined cycle gas turbine. And it's basically a jet engine on a platform. And what it enables you to do is generate electricity at a smaller scale. So think about, last time you were at the airport and you're looking at a plane and that jet engine is maybe only, 6 feet tall as opposed to 12 feet tall. And it can still crank out a lot of work out of that engine. But you can turn it on and off more easily. It uses natural gas as a fuel as opposed to coal. So that really mixes up a lot of the underlying kind of costs and scale economies in the generation side of the industry. So you get a whole bunch of liberalization, deregulation in the generation part of the industry, but the guts of this stuff, right? The distribution, the end use consumers, the guts of this, all still very much vertically integrated. Vertically integrated and regulated from here, even though these generators can now sell in competitive markets. And these folks, the utilities that serve these folks are the ones that are buying from them. All right. So that's a big, big background. I should have also said that I have 4 muses that sit on my shoulder when I think about kind of the political economy framework for analyzing these issues. Muse number 1, have you talked about Elinor Ostrom yet? Or a little bit? So this is Elinor Ostrom, and her work on common pool resource governance issues and the importance of institutions for enabling governance, and that from community self-governance of irrigation systems, right the way through up to questions of how do we, when we think about the ill-defined property rights in something like global climate, what kind of institutions can we come up with to govern use of global climate in ways that can help with mitigation and adaptation of climate change, right? There's a whole bunch of different levels of different places where we can have institutions help us govern our use of common pool resources. Again, this is a property rights issue at its core. But one of the things that she said that in an interview that I find very useful in thinking about regulation is that empirical research does not support the idea that a central agency could solve all resource problems for a large region with simple top-down directives. In electricity, for the past 108 years, we have had a regulatory regime that is very centralized and does rely very much on top-down directives. And one of the things that, and again, I'm going to sound like a technological determinist, one of the things that is breaking that apart in electricity is technological change of a particular kind. Another thing that's happening is, so if you think about that historical story that I just told, that is a story about economics. How can we get the most people getting as much electricity as they want to consume for the lowest possible price, right? How can we get as much electrification as we can, safe, clean, safe, reliable, affordable, for the lowest possible price? It's only in the past 30 years that the policy objectives have enlarged to include environmental questions. And so not only is technology changing, our policy objectives are also changing. And so now we put environmental policy objectives, reducing pollution, dealing with greenhouse gas emissions into the mix as well. Which brings us to today. And today is a really cool place to be because today is full of really interesting disruptive technologies in electricity. And this device that we spend so much of our time fondling and looking at and interacting with has a whole bunch of potential applications and uses that may, and I apologize for using the cliche, but I think it is literally true in this industry, transform this industry in ways that were not anticipated even 20 years ago. So I've got a couple of examples here of the kind of technologies that are really cool. We'll start in the upper right-hand corner. That BMW is really sweet looking. I like it a lot. That's the BMW electric vehicle. So have you thought about the BMW EV for your next vehicle? I'm getting an emphatic no from Professor Munger. It's pretty nice. I've actually been in it. It's nice. If you like the BMW look and feel, it's, so this is an electric vehicle. So much of the internal part of the car is digital. A lot of these digital technologies are, coming out of the same kind of innovations that our phones are. And the other innovation that's in there, and this is the real sticking point, this is the holy grail in this industry, is the battery, right? The battery is what really limits the range that you can drive the thing. It creates a lot of weight. And it's also, in the current technologies, batteries are very, very expensive ways to store electricity. One of the reasons why we have this whole network and why everything that Edison did and his people that followed him were such a big deal is that there's really no economical way to store energy, to store electricity. And so supply has to equal demand in real time. And if that's ever out of balance, so if there's more quantity demanded than quantity supplied, then you have blackouts. If there's more quantity supplied than quantity demanded, then that excess supply gets grounded, right? It goes to ground. And there are stories of, so like for example, in Chicago, there was a power plant that would have excess supply and it would end up kind of boiling the Chicago River near where they were, which is kind of sobering and expensive, right? Economically costly, environmentally costly. So achieving that balance between supply and demand is really important here. So think about what that electric vehicle does for you. As a consumer, it's a car, right? It's going to get you from A to B, transportation. It's going to do so in a way that doesn't involve using petroleum, and so that has its own benefits, although the production process for producing batteries is not environmentally costless, so you have to factor that in as well. But the thing that this will do in your lifetimes, absolutely, maybe the next time you buy a car, is it will make those consumers, those homeowners, those folks hanging at the edge of the network, I flip the switch and the light goes on, you will now be able to be both consumer and producer of electricity. And you, depending on, if my argument happens, then you will be able to not just buy electricity to charge your battery is a piece of storage on the network. And you might be able to sell your excess electricity that's stored in your battery to someone else on a market. And that would be really cool, right? Say your car's at home and it's fully charged and you're not planning to go anywhere, or you're going to go ride your bike or something, and there's a market out there that you can, think of it as like eBay for electricity, and you can, and actually, to be quite honest, it's not eBay for electricity. It's what is the title of a paper I'm working on. It's Airbnb for electricity, right? You've got this battery that with energy stored in it that you're not using. Why don't you sell it to someone who's willing to pay you what you're willing to accept for it, right? This is the Airbnb model. And so that's what the electric vehicle does. It makes those consumers able to be producers and to benefit from owning technologies like that. Another technology that is similar in some respects is rooftop solar photovoltaic power. In just basic economic cost terms, rooftop solar is not yet economically competitive with the centrally generated large-scale electricity. But if you were to factor in some of the environmental costs associated with producing electricity with coal, then the cost balance between the two becomes closer. And so there's a lot of rooftop solar photovoltaic being installed, and it's controlled using a lot of digital technology. And it can be automated using digital technology. The charging cycles of the electric vehicle you can automate using digital technology. And so you can get all kinds of functionality and usefulness, and you can make some money back without you're actually having to sit there and punch buttons and do stuff, right? You can just set kind of triggers of, if the price goes above X, then sell electricity out of my battery, or if the price goes above X, sell the excess generation from my solar panels. That stuff is going to happen, and it's going to happen within the next decade. Technologically, so it's the combination of these distributed energy resources and the digital controllers that allow you to automate them that make this really cool. Another one is, and this is kind of, I just like it because it's really, it just strikes a nice nerdy chord for me, are these intelligent appliances that whenever there's, so say you have a load of clothes in the dryer and you're drying your laundry and there's a price spike because it's a hot August afternoon and electricity has become really expensive, and you've got a rule set for your dryer that if the price goes above 9 cents a kilowatt hour, turn off the heating element and just have it air tumble until the price goes back down, right? So your clothes aren't going to, your clothes aren't going to get, it's not like they're going to be sitting there or anything, but you're reducing your electricity consumption, and you're doing it in an automated way. And you could do that with the chiller in your freezer, the chiller in your refrigerator, without harming the quality of your food. So there's all these kind of different really cool things that you can do at the edge of this network, right? In the home, in what we call the connected home. So how many of you have heard the phrase Internet of Things? Internet of Things, yes. So when we talk about the Internet of Things, the idea is that all devices are going to have some sort of connectivity and some sort of chip in them. And this is the electricity and connected home version of the Internet of Things. Now my question to you is, here's muse number 2, is the economist Joseph Schumpeter. Joseph Schumpeter is the economist who gave us the idea of creative destruction, that the fundamental impulse that keeps the capitalist engine in motion comes from new consumer goods, new methods of production, new markets, new forms of industrial organization that capitalist enterprise creates. And that this is the essential fact of competition. He says capitalism, I'm going to say competition. This is the essential fact of competition and market processes, is that the way we harness our creativity to come up with new technologies and the way firms compete with each other for your business is not by producing more of the same old widget and doing it more cheaply. The way firms compete for your business is by coming up with new, innovative, different products and services, new methods of organizing how they do stuff. That's the essence of competition, according to Schumpeter. And it leads to this gale of creative destruction, where we have new and different products, we have product differentiation, and that makes some of the old stuff obsolete. So my question is this. In that kind of, if Schumpeter's right, I think he is, if Schumpeter's right, and we've got this industry that is very much, and I'm going to make a bold claim here, because Professor Munger said I should make bold claims to give you something to write against in your papers. Technologically, in many ways, for 100+ years, this has been an industry kind of encased in amber, right? These big central generators, these big kind of mechanical wires networks, and then just mechanical stuff at the edge of the network, at the distribution edge, where you flip the switch and the light goes on, or you have to plug in your phone to get it to charge. That system slows down innovation. It basically undercuts this process of creative destruction because it doesn't admit for lots of innovation. It doesn't admit for changes in market definitions. It doesn't admit for different kinds of products, right? One of the things that the regulatory system does in electricity is it defines the product that's being sold, and it defines who's allowed to do it. And it defines that market boundary and sets up a pretty rigid entry barrier. And that's the footprint of the regulated utility. And so, Schumpeter would argue that basically competing with that kind of firm, it's not, the competition is not going to come from someone else coming in and producing electricity more cheaply. It's going to come in from, it's going to happen from someone else coming in and coming up with new and innovative services, bundling things together in ways that you never conceived of, right? And what's we have a good analog for that. Our analog for that is the internet, right? That's precisely what has happened in the internet. So why is this interesting and why should you care? I think you should care, and don't bother to read this. This is just a pointer that in May of 2014, there was a Barclays credit analyst who was advising his clients. So he's advising his investment clients, and he's basically saying, those regulated investor-owned utilities, you should underweight them in your portfolio. Don't stop buying them, but you should keep an eye on them and don't really buy them as much, because we see near-term risks to credit from regulators and utilities falling behind the solar storage adoption curve, falling behind this creative destruction process, and long-term risks from a comprehensive reimagining of the role utilities play in providing electric power. Right? So the process of this disruptive technology production and the creative destruction process is already happening. Why is this a big deal for this industry? This is a big deal for this industry because of what's kind of hyperbolically called the utility death spiral. Dun, dun, dun. Very dramatic. So what's the idea? You're a regulated utility. You basically get your costs plus it's a cost plus system. So you get paid your cost plus some rate of return, and you invest in that wires network and all that stuff. But if because of this innovation at the edge, the solar, the electric vehicles, and energy efficiency technologies, you're buying less electricity and you're generating more of your own for yourself. So that means less revenue for the utility, but they still have to pay those costs. So what does that mean? Customers who still stay with the utility are now going to have to pay higher prices. And demand curves being downward sloping, if customers who are still with the utility are paying higher prices, they're going to have more of an incentive to buy solar panels, buy energy efficiency, do stuff that will enable them to consume less electricity. Lather, rinse, repeat. And so this is one of the concerns that's driving, that's pushing innovation in the electricity industry right now, is this question of the death spiral. I don't think the death spiral is happening, but it's definitely focusing the minds of the regulated utilities in this space. So where does that get us? So I've just told you a story about, you know, 130-year-old industry, much of the technology of which, if Thomas Edison walked into a substation down the street from here today, he would recognize. And we know that's not true in telecoms. Right? When we do the same comparison with telecoms, and you think about, Bell walking into a central station with all the switches, digital switches and everything, that he would just freak out, right? Because it's so unlike what, the system that he invented. But Edison would still pretty much kind of feel at home. And these disruptive technologies that are coming from outside the industry and are coming up around the edge of the distribution network are really putting these pressures on the regulated firms and the regulators to change what they're doing, to change the regulatory institutions, and for the regulated firms to change their business models and their business practices. Problem is, they're regulated firms. And so they're super limited in how much they can actually change what they're doing without the regulators being on board. So you've got two moving parts, both of which are very risk averse and both of which are very hesitant to engage in change. One way of thinking about the goal here is to think about what the Electric Power Research Institute calls the integrated grid. And that's what this idea is, of having a distribution wires network with all of these different capabilities around the edge, whether it's a wind farm or a solar farm or rooftop solar or your electric vehicle under a solar charging canopy, distributed generation. There's distributed generation beside a hospital here somewhere. An office park microgrid, where basically you have an office park with, say, 10 buildings, and they just supply their own. They have their own little grid. And one of the arguments for doing this is the environmental one, cleaner, but it also, having these distributed resources in this integrated grid gives you resilience. And so if our objectives are still safe, reliable, affordable, and now we add cleaner, and so those are our four objectives. One of the things about reliable is going to be stuff like resilience, and especially if we are going to see more variability in things like weather with climate change. One of the things that's going to be important is to have more distributed resources to enable us to rebound quickly from adverse weather events. And more distributed, smaller scale resources are going to give you that resilience where the big central stations are not. Because if they get taken out by a storm, then your power's out for weeks. And so resiliency and cleanliness are two of the big pitches here. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. One of the fathers of the internet is a guy named Vint Cerf. And he's another muse that sits on my shoulder. And he said in an editorial in the New York Times in 2012, what's the internet's secret sauce? Right? What made the internet such a ripe and powerful platform for creating all of the stuff that we all love to use, right? Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and all of the online commerce that we do, right? It really has changed our lives. It's the fact that the internet is a platform for permissionless innovation, right? And any of you who have ever written an app, you know this, right? All you need, like if you want to write an app that sort of fits in with something, you just need to know the API to kind of fit in with Instagram. Just know the API and you can just whoosh, slot right in. That idea of having an open technology standard at the edge of the network, and you can just do stuff with that. That's the idea of permissionless innovation. And that's part of what I'm arguing for in electricity, is to have that open technology standards around the edge of the distribution network. And obviously you want to have some rules for reliability and interconnection so that you don't disrupt the flow of the electrons on the system. But the idea here is the idea of permissionless innovation. And so one of the things that I'm arguing for is that the regulated distribution utility, when the regulators and the regulated utilities are thinking about where should we go, what should we do, that they should move in the direction of a platform business model. So be an Uber for electricity or an Airbnb for electricity. Right. So have the regulated utility be this distribution platform. They own the wires network, but have them offer a retail market. And so, if you have solar panels on your roof, you can sell in this market. You have an electric vehicle, you can sell in this market or buy in this market. Right? So have this retail market where you can buy and sell not just from energy retail providers, but you can buy in from each other. And so that's the argument for having the distribution regulator, the regulated distribution utility become a distribution platform company that allows wires interconnection at the distribution edge through this open technology standard, and then has a market platform on top of that. So you can create value out of operating on top of this platform. And so that's the idea, and I think that's where we're going. The final muse that I have on my shoulder, this is a muse who's always on my shoulder, is the economist Friedrich Hayek. And in his Nobel speech in 1974, he had some advice for regulators, or at least what I'm interpreting as advice for regulators. Now, and here's where the philosophy comes in, right? Because what I think is important about Hayek is very much the epistemology, right? The epistemic Hayek is important, where he says that any individual cannot acquire the full knowledge which would make mastery of the events possible, right? So this is the knowledge problem. And because of that, he argues that anyone therefore has to use what knowledge he can achieve not to shape the results as the craftsman shapes his handiwork, but rather to cultivate a growth by providing the appropriate environment in the manner in which the gardener does this for his plants. One of the ways you can think of regulation, economic regulation in this industry, is that it's engineering, right? We're engineering to a specific economic outcome to achieve particular social objectives. And so we engineer to this particular outcome. Hayek's argument is that because we have this diffuse knowledge and not everyone can master all of the knowledge that's necessary to understand what's going on in any particular situation, that instead we should not think in terms of engineering to precise outcomes. We should think about cultivating an institutional framework in which we enable individuals to apply their knowledge to their own betterment. And in the context of a regulatory framework for this, right, this is precisely the kind of argument for having this platform, this Airbnb for electricity, that now the technology makes it possible for so many more people to transact and to engage with each other in ways that are valuable and that you can automate through the technology. And so the role of the central regulator as the protector of consumers may itself be obsolete. And that perhaps the regulator needs instead to think about cultivating the institutional framework that enables each of us to buy and sell in a retail market like this. And so that's my pitch for why regulated electric utilities should move towards being the Airbnb for electricity. And I'll stop there.
All right.
Questions?
This is your shot.
Yes, sir.
What do you think about like smart grid, like connected power meters and things like that?
Yeah, so I think, so the question is, yeah, what do I think about smart grid? And actually, in full disclosure, for about, starting in 2005, I was a member of something called the GridWise Architecture Council. And we worked on kind of building interoperability standards. So I've been doing smart grid for a long time. And yeah, another way to say this is, this is built on smart grid technology. And so in order to make this work, every one of these facilities would have a digital meter, a smart meter. So is there something in particular other than the meters that you're interested in? Security. Yeah. So this is not all unicorns and rainbows, right? One of the big issues that I think we have to confront, that we confront in any digital network, is cybersecurity. Right? And so I would put cybersecurity number one in terms of challenges and things that we have to think about. We do this not well on the internet. We do it a little bit better in financial services and financial markets. And I know that folks who are working on these issues in electricity, that there are working groups and companies and regulators who are working on cybersecurity issues. And I would put that as the number one challenge and stuff that we have to pay attention to.
Well, on that, is Ted Koppel just nuts? He says it's going to come down in 5 years, and everybody should have a propane generator in their basement.
So this was what, 2 weeks ago on Frontline or whatever? Ted Koppel basically said that, Chicken Little, the sky is falling, and we should all, head for the hills and have 6 months of food. I think,
This is Ted Koppel. It's Ted Koppel.
It's Ted Koppel. I think that is a little bit of hyperbole, but it's certainly worth paying attention to. I think he's exaggerating, but it's not something we should ignore. The other thing that we should do, right, and I know this is something that you always encourage people to do, is we should not engage in the nirvana fallacy, right? In this kind of electricity environment, there would be cybersecurity risks, but in the electromechanical world that, in this network today, there's all kinds of risks of, teenagers in the back of a pickup truck with a big old piece of wood just going out and taking out power lines. So there's real risks in the existing world and in this potential future world, and we have to compare those real risks to each other. Yes, ma'am.
So you said that you see this happening in the next 10 years or so, and I'm wondering, you mentioned there's two sides of the argument. There's the regulators, then there's the utility companies.
Yeah.
And so I understand your argument for why an innovation in this permissionless innovation scheme should work, but do you see any kind of political pushback, lobbyists? What's happening in DC that you think that we could bypass in the next 10 years?
This is a great question. I think one of the, and this is where the public choice aspect of this comes in. The political economy, the public choice end of the political economy is that one of the unintended consequences of this, 108 years of regulation is that it creates two very well established incumbent interests in the status quo: the regulators and the regulated. And they have, and ever since the kind of smaller scale distributed generation has been increasingly economical over the past, say, 15 years, the regulated utilities have fought it. And they're always fighting it, say, oh, it's going to disrupt the system, and oh, well, you say you want to go off the grid, but you're going to really want to come back to us when your system fails, so we're going to charge you a grid standby charge every month of like $300 a month, which is crazy. And so there are ways that they have definitely been trying to slow down or stifle moves in this direction. I think, and this is the sense in which I guess I do have a technological determinist streak, that I think technology is going to keep changing, and they can ignore it or try to stop it, but I think they will ultimately find that they're not successful. And so one of my arguments, when I talk to utility executives, one of my arguments for moving in this direction is, if you're so worried about that death spiral and you're worried about people not using your wire service, why don't you provide them something that they value? Why don't you connect them through a market and then you take a service fee? Hello, Uber. And so I think that's been my argument to them. And I think in a lot of states, New York is one, Illinois is another, there are moves to, they're recognizing that they have to move in this direction. Yes, sir.
This movement towards a more integrated digital system, do you think that movement has any implications towards how the future, how we'll integrate potentially electric currencies like Bitcoin and more digital markets? Do you think that those two things are related at all?
So the question is, does this relate at all to digital currencies, Bitcoin? I think if thinking of digital currencies as a payment, as a way that you can have a highly distributed payment within a highly distributed market, absolutely. But I'm really glad you asked the question, because one of the next pieces of research that I'm going to dig into is actually looking into, right, so there's this physical distribution wires, the electric wires. And there are ways that you can actually make a retail market happen, right? Different types of market design. And the one I think is really interesting is, what if you use blockchain, right? So blockchain is this highly distributed ledger, and it enables kind of pseudonymous, highly distributed trust in transactions. And so what if you build this market platform on blockchain? So that's actually my next. I have a student doing independent study with me in the winter on exactly that question. So I'm glad you asked. Yes, sir.
So using the internet, you did create a lot of different kind of applications. But
Yeah.
if everyone becomes a farmer of electricity, everyone has to make the same frequency electricity that follows all the centers, same frequency.
Yep.
So you're creating the same routes, right? No new creation of product. How can you utilize it, and how can you prove that it is a good market?
That's a great question. I'm going to paraphrase that. But so basically, when you think about electricity, what is it? It's just, you're pushing electrons. Electrons being pushed down a wire, and it's going in a wave. So there's voltage and there's frequency, and so what are the things that are going to have to be uniform and consistent across this whole network? Voltage, frequency, and some of these technology standards around the edge. If you're going to interconnect stuff, you have to operate at this voltage range and this frequency range, and you operate with this particular standard. So the USB, that USB plug where you plug in your little jump drive, that's an example of the kind of interoperability I'm talking about. So some of those we're still going to have as technology standards, right? So voltage and frequency. So what form does innovation take in that kind of world? You're not necessarily innovating because electrons are electrons, right? You're innovating by combining energy management services, or some ability to, retailers or someone who writes an app can, and there's a company out there called O-Power who does this, that they can go in and they can analyze your consumption and identify places where you're consuming more than you should be, or bundling. You can bundle this with other home services like home entertainment or home security, home health management. So this is one way to get a little more kind of remote and autonomous home healthcare into the homes of, say, the elderly. There are all kinds of different ways that you can bundle stuff and layer things on top of that commodity at that voltage and that frequency, right? So I think of like the voltage and frequency as being like the bits. You know, that's the you know, what in the internet, and what you're doing in the internet when you create apps, or you're layering on value on top of the kind of core. So that's how I think about it.
We have time
Cool.
for one more question. Well, it was a brief. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.